The rain fell in sheets, cold and relentless, pounding against the city streets with a kind of fury that mirrored Richard Lawson's own mood. The normally quiet millionaire, known for his stoic demeanor and calculated decisions, was fuming after a particularly brutal confrontation with his board of directors earlier that day. Years of sacrifice and sleepless nights had built his empire, but now they were threatening to take it all away over some reckless accusations of financial mismanagement. It was absurd. He stormed out of the office that evening, without his driver or any entourage. It was late, the city nearly empty, but Richard needed to feel the rain on his face. He needed the cold to remind him he was still in control, that despite everything, he was the master of his own fate. As he crossed a dimly lit intersection, his thoughts swirled with memories of his rise to power, the betrayals, the endless sacrifices. A deafening horn suddenly pierced through his thoughts, but before he could react, headlights bore down on him. A speeding car, out of control, was barreling straight toward him. His body froze, his limbs locked in place as his mind processed the inevitability of the impact. In that split second, his life seemed to unfold before him. The accomplishments, the regrets, the faces of people he had long forgotten. Then, out of nowhere, he felt a force slam into him, but it wasn't the car. A figure collided with him from the side, pushing him with unexpected strength. Richard hit the ground hard, his breath knocked out of him, just as the car swerved violently and skidded past, tires screeching on the wet pavement. It missed him by inches, disappearing into the night without stopping. Gasping for air, Richard rolled onto his back, trying to process what had just happened. His heart pounded in his chest, his body still paralyzed from the shock. But then he saw her, a woman, drenched from head to toe, kneeling beside him. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice trembling with adrenaline. Richard blinked, trying to focus on her face. She looked ordinary, with dark hair clinging to her forehead, eyes wide with concern. She was no more than 30, dressed in a raincoat that had seen better days, and clutched a grocery bag that had spilled onto the street in the commotion. What just happened?" he managed to choke out, still struggling to sit up. "You almost got hit by that car." I didn't think, I just reacted," she said, brushing the rain from her eyes as she helped him up. "You're lucky I was close enough." Richard stared at her in disbelief. Who was this woman? He glanced around at the dark street, realizing how close he had come to death. A deep chill settled into his bones, not from the rain, but from the haunting thought that he could have died tonight, and no one would have been there to stop it. Thank you," he stammered, unsure how to process what had just happened. "You saved my life." The woman gave him a nervous smile, shaking her head. "I just did what anyone would do." Richard doubted that. He knew better than anyone how self-interest ruled people's actions. In his world, no one did anything without expecting something in return. And yet, this stranger had risked her life for him. Someone she didn't know. Someone who would have been just another news headline if things had gone differently. "I don't even know your name," he said, his voice softening. "It's Sarah," she replied, standing up and gathering her scattered groceries. Sarah Whitman. Richard stood, still feeling unsteady, but the gravity of the moment clung to him. He had been ready to lose everything, his company, his legacy, but he hadn't even considered the possibility of losing his life. Not until this woman, Sarah, had stepped in. "Sarah," he repeated, still in a daze. "You really saved me." Before he could ask her anything else, Sarah looked down the street, concern etched on her face. "I should go. My family is waiting for me." With that, she turned and walked off, disappearing into the night, leaving Richard standing alone in the rain, more shaken than he'd ever been in his life. He watched her leave, feeling an unfamiliar sense of helplessness gnaw at him. This wasn't how things worked in his world. In his world, favors were bought, deals were made, and life was dictated by contracts and negotiations. But this was different. It was raw, uncalculated, and utterly selfless. As he stood there, drenched and still trying to piece together what had happened, a question lodged itself in his mind. Who was this woman, and why had she risked everything to save him? Without another word, Richard turned on his heel and started walking in the direction she had gone, driven by something he couldn't yet explain. He had to find out more about Sarah Whitman, the housewife who had just saved his life. Richard Lawson couldn't shake the night's events from his mind. The rhythmic drumming of the rain had long since ceased, replaced by the eerie quiet of dawn. But even as the city began to stir, his thoughts remained locked on that brief, heart-pounding moment when he had come so close to losing his life, and the woman who had pulled him back from the brink. He sat in his study, a vast room filled with dark leather furniture and towering shelves of books that were more decoration than literature. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the room. But Richard barely noticed. His mind was consumed by one thought. Sarah Whitman. Who was she, really? Why had she disappeared so quickly, without so much as asking for anything in return? In his world, that kind of altruism didn't exist. People didn't help others unless there was a gain involved, a transaction that left them better off. But Sarah had walked away, fading into the night as though she had done nothing extraordinary at all. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Thomas, his personal assistant, a man who, in all his years of service, had never once seemed rattled. But now, his eyes flickered with curiosity. "Sir, about last night?" Thomas began, stepping into the room cautiously. "I received your message about the incident. Shall I notify the police or hire private security to investigate the car that nearly hit you?" Richard shook his head. "No, it wasn't intentional. Just a reckless driver in the rain." Thomas paused for a moment, clearly unconvinced. "Very well. If you say so, sir. Though it's quite a coincidence." "Forget the car," Richard said, his voice firm. "I need something else from you. Find out everything you can about a woman named Sarah Whitman." Thomas's eyebrows rose. "Sarah Whitman? Is she connected to what happened?" Richard looked up, fixing Thomas with a rare look of sincerity. "She saved my life." Without another word, Thomas nodded and disappeared from the room. Richard leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. He wasn't used to feeling this unsettled, but the memory of Sarah, her rain-soaked face, her modesty in the wake of what she had done, gnawed at him. For the first time in years, he felt something close to gratitude. Hours passed before Thomas returned with a thin folder in hand. He placed it gently on Richard's desk. "I didn't find much," Thomas admitted. "She seems quite ordinary. A housewife, 2 kids, married to a man named Tom Whitman. He's a mechanic, but it seems he's been out of work for a while now. The family's struggling financially. They live in a small, modest house on the edge of the city. Nothing remarkable." "Nothing remarkable?" Richard echoed, flipping through the sparse information. There were no scandals, no hidden agendas, no ulterior motives, just a simple life. "No, sir," Thomas replied. "I tried to dig deeper, but there's nothing there. She's just an average woman." Richard frowned, feeling an odd sense of disappointment. He had expected something more, some hidden connection, a reason for her actions. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that was the most remarkable thing of all. She had no reason to help him, no gain from it. And yet, she had done it anyway. "That'll be all, Thomas," Richard said, closing the file and dismissing him. Once the door clicked shut, Richard stood and walked over to the window. From his penthouse, he could see the entire city sprawled out before him, glittering with wealth and power. It was a world he knew intimately, a world he had built with his own hands. But looking down at it now, he felt a strange emptiness. His life, for all its success, had become a fortress. He had surrounded himself with people who wanted something from him. Employees, partners, acquaintances, all carefully curated, all calculated relationships that served a purpose. But Sarah Whitman was different. She had stepped into his life for no reason at all, and that unsettled him. Later that evening, after a full day of work that left him restless, Richard found himself pacing in his study once again. His thoughts circled back to Sarah, the woman who had saved him without knowing anything about him. Without fully understanding why, he picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Thomas, send a bouquet of roses to Sarah Whitman. Include a note of thanks. Make sure it's done discreetly." The next day, Sarah Whitman answered her door to find a deliveryman standing on her front step, holding a massive bouquet of red roses. Her brow furrowed in confusion. "Mrs. Whitman?" the man asked, reading from his clipboard. Yes," Sarah replied, stepping aside to let him place the flowers on the small table by the door. She hadn't received flowers in years. Her husband, Tom, used to bring her roses when they were younger, back when things were easier. But now, with 2 kids and bills piling up, those romantic gestures were a distant memory. "Who are these from?" she asked, her heart pounding slightly as she reached for the note tucked between the petals. The card was simple, the handwriting elegant. "Thank you for your selflessness. I am forever grateful. Richard Lawson." Sarah's hands trembled as she read the name. Richard Lawson, the man she had saved. She hadn't expected anything from him. Not flowers, not gratitude, not even recognition. But here it was, a tangible reminder of the man whose life she had changed in an instant. For a moment, she stood frozen, her mind racing. She had seen his face on television, read about him in the papers, a man of immense wealth and power. But last night, he had been just a stranger in danger. Now, it felt like their lives had intersected in a way she hadn't anticipated. Tom came home later that evening, his clothes stained with oil from another day of fruitless job hunting. He glanced at the roses with a scowl. "Who are these from?" he asked, his voice heavy with suspicion. "Just a thank you from that man I told you about." "The one from last night," Sarah explained quickly, hoping to dismiss any tension before it could arise. But Tom's jaw tightened. "A thank you? From some rich guy? What? He thinks a bouquet of roses is enough to repay you for saving his life." Sarah sighed, wishing she could make the whole thing go away. "It's just a gesture, Tom. Nothing more." Tom said nothing, but the atmosphere in their small home felt suddenly stifling. Sarah could sense the unease building in him, the jealousy creeping into his thoughts. The roses, the note, they were symbols of a world far removed from their own, and Tom hated it. That night, as Sarah lay in bed beside her husband, her mind drifted back to Richard Lawson. She wondered what kind of life he led, isolated in his tower of wealth. And as much as she tried to push the thought away, part of her couldn't help but feel a strange connection to him. A man who had entered her life, if only for a fleeting moment, and had left a ripple of change in his wake. Over the next few days, Sarah Whitman tried to return to her usual routine, taking care of her children, managing the household, and helping her husband navigate the increasing pressures of unemployment. Yet, despite her best efforts, she couldn't shake the lingering effect of her encounter with Richard Lawson. The roses, beautiful and out of place, sat on her dining table, a constant reminder of the life she had briefly touched, one so far removed from her own. Meanwhile, Richard Lawson couldn't stop thinking about Sarah. He told himself it was gratitude, a simple debt he felt he owed her for saving his life. But deep down, he knew it was something more, something that gnawed at him every time he thought of her modest home, her quiet strength, and her refusal to be drawn into the orbit of his wealth. She intrigued him in ways he hadn't anticipated. On the 3rd day after the incident, Richard made a decision that even he didn't fully understand. He instructed Thomas, his assistant, to arrange a meeting with Sarah Whitman. This time, it wouldn't be about roses or thank you notes. Richard wanted to see her again, to talk to her, to understand how their worlds could have intersected in such a profound way. Thomas, ever dutiful and professional, hesitated for the first time. "Sir, are you sure this is necessary?" She didn't ask for anything in return. It might be best to leave it at that. Richard's gaze was unwavering. "Just make the call, Thomas." A few hours later, Sarah stood in her small kitchen, nervously fidgeting with the phone in her hand. When Thomas had called her earlier, requesting a meeting on behalf of Richard Lawson, she had been caught off guard. Why would he want to see her again? She had already saved his life and politely declined his offers of help. What more could he want? She glanced at the clock, her heart thudding in her chest. Her kids were at school, and Tom was out again, job hunting. The house felt too quiet, too empty, and the idea of meeting Richard Lawson, alone, left her feeling unsettled. She had agreed to meet him at a nearby cafe, a neutral place where she hoped to keep things simple and avoid the uncomfortable glare of wealth versus modesty. When she arrived at the cafe, Sarah spotted him immediately. Richard Lawson sat at a corner table, his polished appearance making him stand out among the ordinary crowd. He wore an impeccably tailored suit, and though he looked calm, there was something in his eyes that suggested the same restlessness she felt. She hesitated at the door, considering turning back, but something pushed her forward. As she approached the table, Richard stood, offering a polite smile that somehow put her at ease. "Sarah, thank you for agreeing to meet me." She sat down, offering a nervous smile in return. "I'm not sure why you wanted to see me again. I didn't expect anything after that night." Richard nodded, leaning back slightly as he studied her face. "I know you didn't. That's why I'm here. People don't usually do what you did without expecting something in return. And yet, you did." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I didn't think about it like that. I just saw you in danger and acted. I didn't do it for recognition or anything like that." "That's what makes it remarkable," Richard said softly. "In my world, everything is transactional. No one does anything without thinking about what they'll get out of it. But you're different." Sarah blushed slightly, feeling the weight of his words. "I'm not different. I'm just a housewife. I'm sure anyone else would have done the same thing." Richard's eyes darkened as he shook his head. "You underestimate yourself." There was a long silence between them, the hum of the cafe filling the space. Sarah wasn't used to this kind of attention, and it unnerved her. She didn't want to think too deeply about why Richard had sought her out again, or what he might be expecting from her now. "Look," she said, her voice steadying as she tried to steer the conversation. "I'm glad you're okay, really. But I have a family, a life. I don't belong in your world, Richard. I never have, and I don't want to be pulled into it." Richard watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I'm not trying to pull you into anything, Sarah. I owe you something. Not just gratitude, but something more." She frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking a lot about that night," Richard began, his voice lowering, "and it's made me realize just how fragile life is. I've built an empire, amassed wealth, but none of it means anything if it can all be taken away in a split second. You made me see that." Sarah's brow furrowed. "But what does that have to do with me?" Richard hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. "I want to help you. Your family. I know you're struggling. Let me do something to repay you. Financially, emotionally, whatever it is you need." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with the promise of change. Sarah stared at him, her heart racing. Part of her was tempted to accept, to ease the burden of their financial struggles, especially with Tom still out of work. But another part of her recoiled at the idea of becoming indebted to a man like Richard Lawson. She had her pride, and she wasn't about to sell it. "I don't need anything from you," she said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. "I didn't do what I did for a reward." "I know that," Richard replied, his voice soft but insistent. "But I owe you. And maybe this is my way of giving something back, not just to you, but to myself. To remind me that not everything is about power and control." Sarah was silent for a long moment, her mind whirling. She wasn't sure what he was asking of her. Was it just money? Or was it something more? Something that couldn't be bought or repaid? "I don't know," she said finally, feeling torn. "I appreciate the offer, but I need to talk to my husband about this. I can't make decisions like this on my own." Richard nodded, though there was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "Of course. I understand. Talk to him, but know that my offer stands." They finished their conversation with polite goodbyes, but as Sarah left the cafe, she felt a weight settle on her chest. She had hoped the meeting would provide some closure, but instead, it left her with more questions than answers. That evening, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the roses that had begun to wilt. Tom walked in, exhausted from another day of fruitless job hunting. He eyed the flowers, his expression darkening. "What's wrong?" he asked, sensing her unease. Sarah hesitated. "I met with Richard Lawson today." Tom's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "You met him? Why?" What does he want? He said he wants to help us. He feels like he owes me for saving his life. Tom's face twisted with anger. Help us? Or help himself? What's his real angle, Sarah? Men like him don't do anything without expecting something in return. I don't think that's it, Sarah said quietly, though doubt crept into her voice. He seemed genuine. He just wants to repay me. Maybe we should consider it, Tom. It could make things easier for us, for the kids. Tom slammed his hand on the table, startling her. We don't need his charity, Sarah. We're not some project he can throw money at to ease his guilt. Sarah recoiled, her heart pounding. It's not like that, Tom. He's just trying to help. Help. Tom scoffed, his voice bitter. Or is it more than that? Are you sure he doesn't want something else from you? The accusation hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Sarah felt a sting of betrayal in his words, but she couldn't deny that the same thought had crossed her mind. I would never, she began, her voice trembling, but Tom cut her off. Just stay away from him, Sarah. We'll figure this out on our own. Tom stormed out of the room, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts, the weight of Richard's offer pressing down on her. She stared at the roses once more, their once vibrant petals now drooping, and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake by letting Richard Lawson into her life. The days after Sarah's meeting with Richard Lawson passed in an uneasy blur. Her husband, Tom, was colder and more distant than ever, barely speaking to her except when necessary. The tension at home was suffocating, and the children, sensitive to their parents' moods, had begun to tiptoe around the house, as if they, too, feared igniting whatever conflict was brewing. Sarah's thoughts, however, kept circling back to Richard. Despite Tom's anger and suspicion, a part of her couldn't forget the way Richard had looked at her, the sincerity in his eyes when he had offered to help. She felt trapped between two worlds, the comfortable but crumbling life she had known with her family, and the strange, uncertain path that seemed to open up whenever she thought of Richard and his offer. Richard, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about Sarah. She was unlike anyone he had met in years, genuine, unpretentious, and selfless. As his days filled with endless meetings, business negotiations, and power plays, the memory of her face, her voice, kept returning to him. He found himself wondering what she was doing at random moments, imagining her in the small, modest house she had described. Finally, after days of silence, Richard couldn't take it anymore. He picked up the phone and called Sarah again. She answered, her voice tentative, as though she had been expecting this. Sarah, I'm not trying to pressure you, Richard said, his tone softer than usual. But I need to know, have you thought any more about my offer? Sarah glanced at her children playing in the living room, the sound of their laughter filling the house. She sighed, conflicted. I have, she admitted. But Tom, he's not exactly open to the idea. Richard's voice grew more serious. I understand. But this isn't about him. It's about you. You saved my life, and I can't just walk away from that. I need to do something, Sarah. Let me help in any way you'll allow. There was a long pause as Sarah wrestled with her thoughts. Part of her wanted to accept, to ease the burden on her family, but Tom's words echoed in her mind. He didn't want Richard's charity. He didn't trust the man, and she couldn't blame him. In Tom's world, rich men like Richard were dangerous, their intentions never purely altruistic. But Sarah knew there was more to this than money. She felt a strange pull toward Richard, an inexplicable bond that had grown since the night she had saved him. It wasn't attraction, at least not in the way she understood it, but a connection rooted in something deeper, something she couldn't explain. I don't know, she said finally. It feels complicated. Then let me make it simple, Richard replied, his voice steady. Just come and work for me. You can help manage my household, keep everything running smoothly. It's not charity, it's a job, and it pays well. Sarah blinked in surprise. Work for him? She hadn't expected that. I don't know what to say, she stammered. I've never worked like that before. You're smart, Sarah, Richard said, with more confidence than she felt. You've managed a family, a home, and your own life. That's more than enough experience. Think of it as a way for me to repay the debt I owe you. And in return, I'll make sure you and your family never have to worry about money again." The offer hung in the air, both tempting and terrifying. Sarah knew that accepting a job with Richard would change everything. It would mean stepping further into his world, a place she knew Tom wouldn't follow her into. But how much longer could they continue to scrape by, living under the strain of financial worry? Finally, with a heavy heart, she made her decision. "All right," she said softly. "I'll take the job." The next morning, Sarah found herself standing in front of Richard Lawson's sprawling mansion, her heart pounding as she took in the sight. She had seen the house in magazines and on television, but standing before it now, she realized how utterly removed her life had been from this kind of wealth. The gates opened silently, and she made her way up the long, winding driveway. Richard greeted her at the door, dressed casually for once, his usual business attire replaced by a simple sweater and jeans. He smiled warmly, though Sarah noticed the slight tension in his eyes, as if he were just as unsure about this new arrangement as she was. "Welcome, Sarah," he said, gesturing for her to come inside. "I'm glad you're here." The inside of the mansion was even more impressive than she had imagined. An expansive, modern space filled with expensive art and polished surfaces. The air smelled faintly of fresh flowers, and everything looked meticulously arranged. It was a world apart from the clutter and noise of her own home. "I've arranged for you to work closely with my house staff," Richard explained as he led her through the house. "But your main role will be to help oversee things. You'll be my personal assistant of sorts, keeping track of appointments, managing household affairs, that kind of thing." Sarah nodded, though she felt a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. This was so far beyond anything she had ever done before. How could she possibly fit into a place like this? Richard seemed to sense her hesitation. "You'll be fine," he assured her. "I trust you." Those words sent a strange shiver through Sarah. Trust. It wasn't something she heard often from people in positions of power, and certainly not in the world she came from. But Richard said it with such conviction that, for a moment, she believed him. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah began to settle into her new role. She quickly learned the rhythm of the mansion, the comings and goings of the staff, the way Richard liked his day organized, the small details that made everything run smoothly. She wasn't just a housewife anymore. She was part of something bigger, something more demanding. But with each passing day, the bond between her and Richard grew. They spent hours together, discussing not just business or household affairs, but life. His childhood, her dreams, the things they had never shared with anyone else. Richard opened up to her in ways that surprised both of them, revealing the loneliness that came with his wealth and power. "You know," he said one evening, as they sat in the mansion's vast, candlelit dining room after the staff had left, "this house feels different with you in it. Less empty." Sarah smiled, though she felt a pang of guilt as she thought of Tom and the kids. She hadn't expected to spend so much time with Richard, hadn't expected to feel so comfortable around him. And yet, she couldn't deny that something had changed. But it wasn't just the house that felt different, it was her. She was changing, too. Back at home, Tom's mood darkened by the day. He noticed the way Sarah seemed distracted, the way she spoke of Richard's mansion with a strange mixture of awe and trepidation. The money was good, better than anything they had ever known, but it came at a cost, one that Tom wasn't willing to pay. One evening, as Sarah prepared dinner, Tom slammed a bottle of beer down on the table. "So," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm, "how's your new life in that millionaire's palace?" Sarah froze, feeling the weight of his words. "It's just a job, Tom. I'm doing this for us. For the kids." Tom scoffed, his anger barely contained. "For us? Or for him? Because from where I'm standing, it seems like you're more concerned about Richard Lawson than you are about your own family." "That's not fair," Sarah shot back, her voice rising. "You know that's not true." Tom stood, his eyes blazing with fury. "Isn't it? You spend more time with him than with us. You come home smelling like his mansion, talking about his world like you belong there. But you don't, Sarah. You never will." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, the tension between them snapping like a rubber band stretched too thin. She wanted to scream, to explain that she was doing this to keep them afloat, to give their children a better life. but the words stuck in her throat. "I'm trying to help," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. Tom looked at her for a long moment, his expression softening for just a second before the hardness returned. "Just remember where you came from," he muttered, storming out of the house and slamming the door behind him. As the sound echoed through the empty kitchen, Sarah collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. She had never felt so torn, pulled between the life she had always known and the strange, alluring world that Richard had drawn her into. And deep down, she feared that she was already in too deep. Sarah lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, her mind swirling with thoughts of Tom, her children, and Richard. The argument with Tom had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. His words echoed in her head, "You don't belong there." But what if he was right? What if this new world she was stepping into wasn't meant for someone like her? And yet, despite her doubts, she couldn't deny that the connection she was building with Richard felt genuine. She wasn't seeking his wealth, nor did she want the life that came with it. But there was something about him, his loneliness, his vulnerability, that pulled her in. The next morning, Sarah got up early and prepared breakfast for the kids before they left for school. Tom hadn't come home that night. He'd spent the night out, likely drinking with his old friends. The space he left behind felt heavy, but Sarah forced herself to focus on her day ahead, leaving her guilt and confusion behind as she headed to Richard's mansion. When she arrived, Richard greeted her at the door, his expression warm, though there was a flicker of concern in his eyes as he took in her weary face. "You look tired," he said softly. "Is everything all right?" Sarah managed a small smile. "Just a long night. Tom wasn't happy about me taking this job, but we'll work through it." Richard's gaze lingered on her for a moment, his eyes clouded with something unspoken. "If this is causing problems between you and your family, I don't want to make things harder for you." "No," Sarah said quickly, shaking her head. "It's not that. I just need to find a balance. Tom, he's not in a great place right now, with work and everything. He's feeling threatened." Richard nodded slowly, as if weighing his next words carefully. "I understand. But you're doing something important, Sarah, for your family. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve that." She felt a warmth in his words, a reassurance she didn't realize she had been craving. But at the same time, a part of her wondered if Richard truly understood what it was like to struggle the way she and Tom did. His world, for all its glamour and power, was so far removed from the one she had lived in her entire life. As the weeks passed, Sarah settled further into her role at Richard's mansion. She became indispensable to him, handling his appointments, organizing events, and even managing the personal side of his life, the things he never had time to deal with. They spent hours together, and with each passing day, their bond grew deeper. At home, however, things were spiraling out of control. Tom's bitterness had only grown, fueled by his suspicion of Richard and Sarah's relationship. He had found a temporary job at a local garage, but it wasn't enough to lift his spirits. He saw the money Sarah was bringing in from her new position, but rather than easing the financial strain, it only seemed to deepen the divide between them. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, Tom confronted Sarah in the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, watching her as she cleaned up. "So, how's your day at the palace?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to keep her patience. "It's not a palace, Tom. It's just work." Tom scoffed. "Work? You call spending your days with Richard Lawson work? Come on, Sarah, don't insult my intelligence. I know what's going on." She froze, turning to face him. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You're spending more time with him than you are with us," Tom snapped. "You're practically living in that mansion. And don't think I haven't noticed how much you've changed since you started working for him." "I haven't changed," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I'm still the same person. I'm just doing what I need to do to support this family." "No, you're doing what you need to do to support him," Tom shot back, his eyes blazing with jealousy. "It's like you've forgotten who you are. You're not one of them, Sarah. You don't belong in his world." Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I'm not choosing him over you, Tom. I'm doing this for us, for the kids. Why can't you see that?" Tom's face twisted with frustration. Because it's not about us anymore, is it? It's about him. The rich guy who swooped in to save you. You think I don't see the way he looks at you? That's not what this is, Sarah insisted, her voice rising. Richard respects me. He's not trying to take me away from you. Tom let out a bitter laugh. Right. Because men like Richard Lawson always have pure intentions, don't they? Before Sarah could respond, Tom stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. She stood there, her heart racing, the weight of his accusations pressing down on her. For the first time, she wondered if there was some truth in his words. Was she letting herself get too close to Richard? Was she blind to something that was right in front of her? The following day, Sarah arrived at Richard's mansion, trying to push the fight with Tom out of her mind. But it clung to her like a shadow, following her through the halls as she tried to focus on her work. Richard noticed her distraction, and after their morning meeting, he asked her to stay behind. What's going on, Sarah? He asked, his voice gentle. You've been off all day. She hesitated, not sure if she should tell him the truth. But then, the words came tumbling out. It's Tom. He's upset about me working here. He thinks there's something going on between us. Richard's expression hardened slightly, though his voice remained calm. And what do you think? Sarah looked at him, her heart pounding. I don't know. I've never seen it that way. You've been kind to me, and I appreciate everything you've done. But Tom thinks I'm crossing a line, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And I don't know if he's right. Richard stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. Sarah, I would never do anything to hurt you or your family. I respect you too much for that. I know, she said quickly. It's just, everything's gotten so complicated. A long silence fell between them, and for the first time, Sarah felt the full weight of the growing tension between them. She had convinced herself that it was purely professional, that their connection was rooted in gratitude and trust. But now, standing so close to Richard, she couldn't deny the undercurrent of something deeper, something neither of them had acknowledged, but both had felt. Just as Sarah opened her mouth to say something, anything to break the tension, there was a knock on the door. Thomas, Richard's assistant, stepped in, holding a file in his hand. Mr. Lawson, you need to see this, he said, his tone urgent. Richard took the file, flipping it open. His face darkened as he scanned the contents. What is it? Sarah asked, sensing the shift in his mood. Richard's jaw tightened. It's a threat. Sarah frowned. A threat? He handed her the file. Inside was a note, typed and anonymous, with a simple, chilling message. You're not as safe as you think. Stay out of our way, or next time, you won't be so lucky. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This is about the accident, isn't it? The car that almost hit you that night? Richard nodded grimly. It wasn't an accident. Someone wants me dead. A cold dread washed over Sarah as she stared at the note. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The world she had entered wasn't just one of wealth and privilege. It was one of danger, too. And now, she was tangled in it. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice shaking. Richard's eyes met hers, full of determination. I'm going to find out who's behind this, and I'm going to stop them. But Sarah, I need you to stay away from this. It's too dangerous. But Sarah shook her head, her resolve hardening. No, I'm already involved, whether I like it or not. I saved your life once, Richard. I'm not going to let anyone take it now. As the day ended, Sarah's mind raced with thoughts of betrayal, danger, and the deepening conflict in her life. She knew that she was stepping into a world that was far beyond anything she had ever imagined. A world where the stakes weren't just about money or power, but life and death. And the question that haunted her was simple but terrifying. How far would she be willing to go to protect Richard? And in doing so, what would she lose? The tension in Sarah's life had reached an unbearable point. Every day, she walked a tightrope between her crumbling marriage and the increasingly complex relationship she had with Richard. The threatening note had opened her eyes to the true dangers of his world, a world she was now deeply entangled in. Tom's suspicions had driven a wedge between them, and Sarah feared that no matter what she did, things would never return to normal. 2 weeks had passed since the note, but Richard hadn't told anyone beyond his inner circle. He had hired more security and tightened his operations, but Sarah sensed his frustration. He didn't know who was behind the threat, and the uncertainty was gnawing at him. One afternoon, as she finished reviewing household tasks, Richard called her into his study. He stood by the window, his back to her, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The storm clouds outside seemed to mirror his mood. "Sarah, I don't want you involved in this," he said, his voice low but firm. "I can handle it." Sarah crossed her arms, her jaw set. "I'm already involved, Richard. If someone's targeting you, then I'm a part of it whether I want to be or not." He turned to face her, his eyes flashing with a mixture of concern and something deeper. "I won't let you be hurt because of me. You didn't let me get hurt the first time either, remember? I was the one who saved you." Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "That's exactly why I can't let this happen again. Whoever is behind this, they're playing a dangerous game, and I don't want you caught in the crossfire." Just as Sarah was about to argue further, there was a knock on the door. It was Thomas, holding a folder. His expression was grim. "We have a lead," Thomas said, his voice clipped. "I think you'll want to see this." Richard opened the folder, his eyes scanning the contents. His face darkened. Without a word, he handed the file to Sarah. She hesitated before looking down at the page. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the name at the top. Tom Whitman. "No," Sarah whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "This can't be right. Tom would never." Richard's voice was quiet but firm. "Sarah, it's not a coincidence. The timing, the way he's been acting, he's tied to this." Sarah felt the room spin around her. Tom? Her husband? Could he really be involved in trying to kill Richard? It didn't make sense. Yes, Tom was angry, bitter, even, but to be part of something like this? "I don't believe it," she said, her voice trembling. "He's upset, but he's not capable of something like this." Richard reached out, gently touching her arm. "I know this is hard to accept, but we need to be careful. I'll have more people looking into it, but you need to be cautious around him." Sarah's heart raced as she struggled to process what she had just learned. Was it possible that Tom's jealousy and resentment had driven him to something so dark? Or was there more to the story? Something she didn't yet understand? That evening, Sarah returned home, her mind spinning with doubts and questions. Tom greeted her, his usual scowl in place, but she couldn't look at him the same way. She searched his face for any sign of deception, but all she saw was the man she had married, the father of her children. Could he really be behind the threats against Richard? Or was he just a pawn in someone else's game? As they sat down to dinner, the silence between them was unbearable. Tom noticed her tension, his eyes narrowing. "What's wrong with you?" he asked, his tone sharp. "You've been acting strange for weeks." Sarah hesitated, wondering if she should confront him. But she couldn't. She didn't have proof, only suspicions. For now, she had to keep quiet. She had to find out the truth before she could accuse him of something so unforgivable. "Just tired," she said quietly, forcing a smile. "Work's been exhausting." Tom grunted in response, but his eyes lingered on her longer than usual, as if he could sense the lie beneath her words. That night, Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind raced with conflicting emotions. She didn't want to believe that Tom could be involved in such a horrific plot, but the evidence was damning. If it were true, it would shatter everything she had ever known. And then there was Richard, complicated, mysterious, and now at the center of her world in ways she never could have imagined. Protecting him had become more than just a job. It was personal. As the storm raged outside, Sarah knew one thing for sure. The truth would soon come out. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same. The days following the revelation of Tom's possible involvement felt like a blur to Sarah. Every moment she spent at home was tainted with suspicion, and every interaction with her husband was fraught with tension. Her heart wanted to believe that Tom was innocent, but her mind was consumed with doubt. How could the man she had shared her life with, the father of her children, be entangled in something so sinister? At Richard's mansion, the atmosphere was equally tense. Richard had doubled his security and was more guarded than ever, but his calm exterior did little to ease Sarah's growing fear. Every time she looked at him, she felt the weight of her secret, the possibility that the man she was trying to protect might be in danger from someone far closer than they had ever imagined. Late one evening, Richard called Sarah into his study again. The house was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the city outside. When she entered, she found him sitting at his desk, a laptop open in front of him. His eyes were hard, focused. "We've gathered more information," he said, not looking up. "It's worse than we thought." Sarah's heart sank. "What do you mean?" Richard turned the laptop around, showing her a series of financial transactions. The screen displayed bank transfers, dates, and amounts. One name stood out, Tom Whitman. The payments were large, staggered over months. It was clear now, Tom wasn't just a pawn in someone else's game. He was actively involved. "These transfers," Richard said quietly, "came from an account linked to one of my competitors. Someone who has been trying to undermine my business for years." Sarah felt her blood run cold. She scanned the screen, her eyes locking onto the dates. The payments had started shortly after Tom lost his job, just as their financial troubles had begun to spiral out of control. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "He wouldn't do this. He wouldn't." But the evidence was undeniable. The man she had once trusted completely had been hiding a secret, one that could tear their family apart. "I don't think he wanted this to go this far," Richard continued, his voice softer now. "He may have been desperate. Someone probably approached him when he was vulnerable. But that doesn't change the fact that he's involved, Sarah. He's been working with them." Sarah sat down in the chair opposite Richard, her legs trembling. "What am I supposed to do? He's my husband. We have children together." Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know, but we need to act fast. If he's involved in this, he's dangerous. For both of us." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to comprehend the enormity of the situation. Tom had betrayed her, had endangered not only Richard but their entire family. But part of her still wanted to believe there was an explanation, some reason for why he had done this, something that could make sense of it all. "I need to talk to him," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I need to find out the truth." That evening, Sarah returned home with a heavy heart. Tom was sitting in the living room, watching television, his face illuminated by the flickering light of the screen. The kids were already in bed, the house eerily quiet. Sarah stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him, trying to reconcile the man she loved with the person who had betrayed them. Finally, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Tom, we need to talk." He glanced at her, his eyes tired and wary. "What's this about?" Sarah sat down on the edge of the couch, her heart pounding. "I know." Tom's face stiffened. "Know what?" "About the money. The transfers. You've been working with someone to undermine Richard." There was a long, tense silence. Tom's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might deny it. But instead, he sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I didn't want it to go this far," he muttered. "I didn't have a choice, Sarah." Her chest tightened. "You always have a choice, Tom. Why? Why would you do this?" Tom rubbed his hands over his face, avoiding her gaze. "It started after I lost the job. I was desperate. We were drowning in debt, and I couldn't provide for you and the kids. Then someone approached me, someone who knew about Richard. They offered money, a way out of the mess. All I had to do was give them information, little things. I didn't think it would turn into this." "And the accident?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "The car that almost hit him?" Tom shook his head, his voice cracking. "I didn't know about that, I swear. I never wanted him dead. I didn't think it would go this far." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as the full weight of Tom's betrayal settled over her. She had loved him, trusted him, and now, everything she thought she knew about her husband was crumbling before her eyes. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "How could you risk everything, our family, for money?" Tom finally looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I could fix everything before it got out of control. But now, I don't know how to stop it." Sarah stood, unable to sit any longer. You've put us all in danger, Tom. Not just Richard, but me, the kids. What if they come after us next? I won't let that happen, Tom said, standing as well. I'll fix this, I promise. I'll make it right. But Sarah didn't believe him. How could she, after everything? She turned away, tears streaming down her face. I don't know if you can, she said quietly. I don't know if any of this can be fixed. That night, Sarah barely slept. The weight of Tom's betrayal crushed her, and she felt as if the walls were closing in. The man she had once loved now felt like a stranger, and the life they had built together was crumbling before her eyes. The next morning, she returned to Richard's mansion, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what she had learned. Richard was waiting for her, his expression tense. Well? He asked. Sarah nodded, her voice hollow. It's true. He's involved. But he says he didn't know about the attempt on your life. He swears he never wanted you dead. Richard's face hardened. It doesn't matter what he wanted. He's part of this, Sarah. And now, we need to act. Sarah's stomach churned. She knew what Richard meant. Tom had crossed a line, and there would be consequences. But she wasn't sure she could bear to see them play out. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice trembling. Richard looked at her, his expression unreadable. I'm going to make sure this ends. I'm going to stop whoever's behind this. And if your husband is part of that. He didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. Tom's fate was now in Richard's hands. And Sarah, torn between the man she had married and the man who had come to trust her, wasn't sure where her loyalties lay. As she left Richard's mansion, Sarah felt a deep sense of foreboding. The truth was out, but the consequences were only beginning. And she feared that before this was over, she would lose everything. The weight of Sarah's decision hung over her like a storm cloud as she drove home that evening. She had left Richard's mansion without any clear answers, torn between loyalty to her husband and the dark truth of his actions. The revelation that Tom had betrayed her, not just as a partner but as a father and a man, gnawed at her heart. It had shattered the trust they once shared. And now, knowing that Richard would take matters into his own hands, Sarah feared the consequences of her silence. When she walked into the house, the tension was palpable. Tom was in the kitchen, his hands gripping the countertop, his face strained with guilt. He knew that Sarah had told Richard the truth, and now they were both trapped in the fallout. Sarah, Tom began, his voice hoarse, I'll leave. I'll disappear if that's what it takes to protect you and the kids. Sarah stood frozen, watching him. She wanted to scream, to demand how he could have brought them to this point, but she was too exhausted to fight anymore. You think that's the answer? She whispered. You think leaving is going to fix everything? Tom looked down, shame etched across his features. It's all I can do now. I've ruined everything. She approached him slowly, feeling the enormity of what she was about to say. Richard knows everything, Tom. He's not going to let this slide. Tom's face paled, his hands clenching into fists. Then it's too late. For a long moment, the silence between them felt insurmountable. Sarah didn't know what to say. Her heart ached for the man Tom had once been, the husband who had shared her dreams, the father who had loved their children with everything he had. But that man was gone, replaced by someone she no longer recognized. I never meant for it to go this far, Tom muttered, his voice cracking. I just wanted to protect us. I thought if I could give them what they wanted, it would all be over. But it spiraled out of control. Sarah shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. You didn't just betray Richard. You betrayed me. Our family. Do you even understand what you've done? I do, he said quietly, and I'll never forgive myself. Meanwhile, at Richard's mansion, the situation had escalated rapidly. The files linking Tom to the rival business mogul who had been trying to destroy Richard's empire were now in the hands of Richard's legal team. But that wasn't enough. Richard was determined to stop this at its root, and that meant confronting the people pulling the strings. Richard's frustration boiled over. His carefully constructed world had been under siege, and now the betrayal of someone close to Sarah made it all the more personal. He had grown to trust her, to value her presence in his life, and now it felt like the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. As he paced in his office, Thomas, his assistant, entered with a grave expression. "We've tracked down the man behind the payments," he said. "It's Victor Grant, the CEO of Versotech. He's been trying to take over your contracts for months." Richard clenched his jaw. Victor Grant, a man notorious for underhanded tactics, ruthless in business. And now, Richard knew that Tom had been working for him all along, feeding him information in exchange for money. "What's our next move?" Thomas asked, his voice low. "We go after him," Richard said coldly. "No more games." That evening, as Sarah sat in the living room, trying to make sense of the mess her life had become, she received a text from Richard. "We need to meet. Now." She stared at the message, her heart racing. There was no avoiding this confrontation, no pretending that the storm would pass without consequences. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her coat and left the house without a word to Tom. When she arrived at Richard's mansion, he was waiting for her in the study. The tension in the air was thick, and Sarah felt the weight of what was about to happen. "We've tracked down the man behind this," Richard said, his eyes cold and focused. "Victor Grant. He's been using your husband to get to me." Sarah swallowed hard, the reality of the situation sinking in even further. "And now?" "And now," Richard continued, "we make sure Grant doesn't get what he wants. He's going to face the consequences." "But Sarah?" He paused, his gaze softening slightly. "This isn't just about business anymore. I need to know, what are you going to do about Tom?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been avoiding the truth for too long, but now it was staring her in the face. Tom's betrayal had shattered everything they had built together, and Sarah knew there was no going back. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can forgive him, but he's still the father of my children. I can't just abandon him." Richard nodded, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Disappointment, maybe, or understanding. "I'm not asking you to, but you need to decide where your loyalties lie. Tom's actions have endangered everyone around him, including you. And if we don't stop Grant, he'll come after all of us." Sarah took a deep breath, her mind swirling with the gravity of the situation. She had never imagined her life would come to this, a battle between the man she had loved and the man she had come to trust. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady now. Richard looked at her, his expression resolute. "I need you to be ready for what's coming. Grant isn't going to back down easily. And if Tom is still working with him, we need to know." The implication of his words was clear. If Tom was still involved with Grant, he was a threat. And Sarah wasn't sure if she could handle what that meant. "I'll talk to Tom," she said quietly. "I'll get the truth." Richard nodded, though his eyes lingered on her, as if weighing the risk. "Be careful, Sarah. This isn't just about business anymore. It's about survival." That night, Sarah returned home, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. Tom was sitting in the dark, waiting for her. He looked up as she entered, his face etched with guilt and fear. "What did Richard say?" Tom asked, his voice hoarse. Sarah stared at him, the man she had once loved, now a shadow of himself. "He knows everything, Tom. About you. About Grant." Tom's face paled. "I'll fix it, Sarah. I swear. I'll make this right." But Sarah shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You can't fix this. You've broken something that can't be repaired. And now we're all in danger." Tom reached for her, but Sarah stepped back, her heart aching. She wanted to believe him, to believe that there was still hope for their family, but the damage was too deep. "I'm going to protect our kids," she said firmly. "But I don't know if I can protect you." Tom's face crumpled, and for the first time, Sarah saw the full weight of his regret. But it was too late. The storm was coming, and there was no stopping it now. As Sarah lay in bed that night, the weight of her choices pressed down on her. She knew that by morning, everything would change. And when it did, she would have to face the consequences, no matter what they were. The morning dawned gray and cold, a reflection of the tension in Sarah's heart as she prepared for the day ahead. Her conversation with Tom the night before had left her shaken, but the reality of what needed to be done was clearer than ever. Richard had made it clear. Victor Grant was a threat, and Tom was deeply entangled in the web of betrayal. It was no longer just about money or business. It was about survival. At breakfast, Tom avoided her gaze. He knew his time was running out, and the weight of his actions hung between them like a thick fog. The children, sensing the tension, ate their cereal in silence, casting worried glances at their parents. Sarah's heart ached as she looked at them. She had to protect them, no matter what. After dropping the kids at school, Sarah drove straight to Richard's mansion. Today, they would confront Victor Grant head-on. Richard had set a plan in motion, a final, calculated move that would expose Grant's involvement and put an end to the threat once and for all. But there was a risk that Tom's connection to the man might pull them all into the crossfire. When she arrived, Richard was waiting in his study, a grim determination in his eyes. He had barely slept, his mind focused on dismantling the operation that had been built to destroy him. Sarah had seen him like this before, driven, unyielding, but now there was something personal in his intensity. He wasn't just fighting for his empire. He was fighting for her, too. "Are you ready?" he asked as soon as she stepped into the room. Sarah nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "What's the plan?" "We've tracked Grant to a location downtown. A meeting's set to go down today, and we have someone on the inside who's feeding us information. This will be our chance to confront him and expose everything." Sarah's heart pounded. "What about Tom?" Richard hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "If Tom's there, we'll handle it. But, Sarah, you need to understand. If he's still working with Grant, if he's involved in this meeting, there's no way out for him." The reality of Richard's words struck her like a blow. If Tom was still involved, if he hadn't distanced himself from Grant, then there was no way to protect him. And in the depths of her heart, Sarah knew Tom wouldn't just walk away. His desperation had driven him too far. The hours ticked by slowly as Sarah and Richard waited for the final pieces to fall into place. They would head to the meeting location in a few hours, but until then, they sat in tense silence. Sarah's mind raced, torn between the husband she had loved and the man who had betrayed her. As the sun began to set, Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then stood abruptly. "It's time." The drive to the warehouse downtown was quiet, the tension between Sarah and Richard thick. Neither of them spoke, but the weight of the upcoming confrontation was palpable. Sarah could feel her heart hammering in her chest, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if Tom was still working with Grant? What if this confrontation spiraled out of control? When they arrived, the scene was already set. Richard's team, his private security detail, had surrounded the area, and inside the warehouse, Victor Grant was preparing for his next move, one that he believed would cripple Richard's empire for good. As they entered the building, Sarah's stomach twisted with anxiety. The space was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and the stale scent of abandonment. She could hear voices echoing from deeper inside, the sound of men discussing their plans, unaware that they were walking into a trap. Richard moved swiftly and silently, his security team following close behind. Sarah stayed close to him, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't prepared for what was coming next, but there was no turning back now. They rounded a corner and entered a large, open room. There, standing at the center of the gathering, was Victor Grant. Tall and imposing, his sharp features were lit by the dim glow of a single hanging light bulb. Several men surrounded him, but it was the figure standing just behind him that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was Tom. Her heart clenched painfully in her chest. He's still working with Grant. The realization hit her with crushing certainty, and she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Tom had betrayed her, betrayed their family, and now, there was no way to undo what he had done. Richard stepped forward, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Victor Grant." Grant turned slowly, a twisted smile creeping across his face as he spotted Richard. "Lawson, I was wondering when you'd show up." "You thought you could take me down," Richard said, his voice steady, though there was an undercurrent of fury. "You thought you could use people close to me to do it. But you've lost, Grant. It's over." Grant laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "You think it's over because you showed up here? You have no idea what's coming next." Richard's security detail moved in closer, surrounding the room, but Grant didn't seem fazed. He turned his gaze toward Tom, a a look of satisfaction in his eyes. "And you brought the woman's husband," Grant sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "Perfect timing." Sarah's heart raced as she glanced at Tom, hoping for some sign of remorse, some flicker of guilt. But he only looked back at her with an expression of defeat. "It wasn't supposed to end like this," Tom muttered, his voice hollow. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "But it has," Richard said coldly. "And now, you'll face the consequences." The tension in the room snapped like a coiled wire. Grant made a sudden move, pulling out a concealed weapon, and chaos erupted. Richard's security team acted swiftly, disarming Grant before he could fire, but the scuffle that followed was brief and brutal. In the confusion, Tom moved toward Sarah, his face a mask of desperation. "Sarah, I'm sorry," he gasped, grabbing her arm. "I didn't want this." But Sarah pulled away, her heart breaking. "It's too late, Tom. You chose this." Before she could say anything more, Richard's men restrained Tom, holding him back as they secured the room. Sarah stood frozen, her mind reeling from everything that had happened. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by someone she no longer recognized. Victor Grant, defeated and subdued, was taken away by Richard's security. But even as he was led out of the warehouse, his gaze lingered on Sarah, his smile twisted and dark. "This isn't over," Grant called out as he was dragged away. "You'll never be safe." The ride back to Richard's mansion was quiet, the weight of what had just happened settling over them like a heavy fog. Tom had been arrested, and Sarah knew that their marriage, everything they had built, was over. There was no going back from this. As they arrived at the mansion, Richard turned to her, his expression softer now. "I'm sorry about Tom. I didn't want it to end this way." Sarah shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It wasn't your fault. He made his choices." Richard reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "You don't have to go through this alone, Sarah. You have a future beyond this." She looked up at him, her heart heavy but full of gratitude. She had lost so much, but Richard had been her constant through it all. And now, as the storm began to clear, she realized that she wasn't as alone as she thought. The danger had passed, but the scars would remain. Sarah knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready to face it. Because for the first time in a long time, she knew who she was, and she knew that no matter what came next, she could survive it. In the days following the confrontation, the world felt quieter, but heavier, as though the weight of everything that had happened lingered in the air. Sarah moved through her life in a daze, balancing the mundane tasks of motherhood with the haunting reality that Tom was gone. Not just from their home, but from her heart. The betrayal had been too deep, the damage too great. The man she had once loved, the father of her children, was now a stranger behind bars, awaiting trial for his part in Victor Grant's plot. The news of Grant's downfall spread quickly. Richard's enemies, once emboldened by the potential to cripple his empire, retreated in the wake of Grant's arrest. The takeover attempt had failed, and Richard's business remained intact, stronger than ever. But the victory felt bittersweet for Sarah, who had lost so much in the process. She hadn't seen Tom since the night of the raid. The children didn't understand why their father had suddenly disappeared from their lives, and Sarah wasn't ready to explain the full truth. For now, she told them that their father had to go away for a while. But the hollow look in her eyes betrayed her sadness. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch watching the kids play in the yard, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Richard. "Come by the house. I have something for you." A part of her hesitated. Their relationship had changed after everything that had happened, deepening in ways she hadn't anticipated. But another part of her, the part that felt safe with Richard, knew she couldn't keep avoiding him forever. They had been through too much together to simply drift apart. When Sarah arrived at Richard's mansion, the air felt different, calmer, as though the house itself had absorbed the tension and was now breathing easier. Richard greeted her at the door, dressed casually for once, a soft smile on his face. "Come in," he said, leading her into the large sitting room where they had spent so many tense evenings. But today, there was no urgency in the air, no looming threats. It was just the two of them. "I wanted to give you something," Richard said as they sat down. He handed her an envelope, thick and heavy in her hands. Sarah frowned as she opened it, pulling out a set of papers. Her eyes widened in shock as she realized what it was: the deed to a house. A beautiful, modest house on the outskirts of the city, far from the chaos that had consumed her life over the past months. "This is," she stammered, looking up at him in disbelief. Richard nodded. "It's yours. I bought it for you and the kids. I know things have been difficult, and I thought you might need a fresh start. Somewhere safe. Somewhere you can rebuild." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. "Richard, I can't accept this. You've already done so much for me." "It's not charity, Sarah," Richard said softly. "It's a gift. You've been through more than anyone should have to endure, and I know how hard it's been. This is just my way of helping you move forward." Sarah looked down at the papers, overwhelmed by the generosity of his gesture. She had never asked for anything, never expected anything, but Richard had given her more than she could have imagined. A chance to start over, to rebuild her life after it had been torn apart. "Thank you," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know how to repay you." Richard reached out, gently taking her hand. "You don't need to. You've been by my side through all of this, and I owe you more than I can say." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of everything they had been through settling between them. There was an unspoken understanding in the air, a bond that had been forged in the fire of betrayal, danger, and survival. A few weeks later, Sarah moved into the new house with her children. It was a modest home, cozy and filled with light, surrounded by a peaceful neighborhood far removed from the chaos of the city. The kids adjusted quickly, their laughter filling the air as they explored the backyard and settled into their new rooms. For the first time in months, Sarah felt a sense of peace. Tom remained in custody, awaiting trial for his involvement in the plot against Richard. Sarah visited him once, just before she moved. The encounter had been brief and painful. Tom had apologized over and over again, but the damage was too deep, the wounds too fresh. Sarah had told him she would support him for the sake of the children, but their marriage was over. There was no going back. In the weeks that followed, Sarah found solace in her new life. She had taken a job at a local community center, helping families in need, a way to give back after all the help she had received. The work was fulfilling, and it reminded her that there was still goodness in the world, even after everything she had been through. Richard visited often. He would drop by unexpectedly, bringing small gifts for the kids or simply sitting with her on the porch, talking about life, work, and the future. Their bond remained strong, but it was different now, grounded in mutual respect and a shared history. They had been through too much together to ever go back to being just strangers. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Richard arrived at the house with a bottle of wine and a quiet smile. Sarah welcomed him inside, and they sat on the porch, watching the children play in the yard. "You seem happy," Richard remarked, his voice soft. "I am," Sarah said, surprised by how true the words felt. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like things are going to be okay." Richard looked at her, his eyes warm. "You deserve that. After everything you've been through, you deserve peace." Sarah smiled, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. She had lost so much, her marriage, the life she had once known, but she had gained something far more valuable: strength, resilience, and, most importantly, a future she could believe in. As the evening wore on, the conversation drifted, but the unspoken connection between them remained. Richard stood to leave just as the stars began to appear in the sky. He looked at her for a long moment before saying, "I'm always here if you need anything. You know that, right?" Sarah nodded, her heart full of gratitude. "I know. Thank you, Richard, for everything." He gave her one last smile before turning to leave, his figure fading into the night. As Sarah watched him go, she realized that, while her journey had been difficult, it had led her to a place of strength and clarity. The storm had passed, and now, she was free to build the life she wanted, for herself and for her children. And for the first time in a long time, she knew she would be okay.